all the colleagues involved. We now move on to point 11, the Fundamental Rights Agency selection procedure for the candidates for the post of the FRA, further to Article 15 of the Council regulation. Particularly want to thank the members who have come in for this point. It's late on the Thursday. I do apologise for the scheduling. Something has to be scheduled at this point, but I do want to thank members who have taken the time to come in for this. It's a very important point. So I'm just coming to some new notes for this. Sorry, colleagues, I have to draw some lots, so I'm just checking the procedure. Okay, colleagues, so if everyone's ready, we now proceed to the hearing for the appointment of the Director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. In this procedure, according to Article 15 of the regulation, the European Parliament and the Council are called on to give their opinion and state their orders of preference amongst the candidates. We're going to hear individually the three shortlisted candidates set out in Article 15, brackets 2 of Regulation 168/2007. I'm just going to read out the article very quickly. The article lays down that A, on the basis of a list drawn up by the Commission after a call for candidates and a transparent selection procedure, applicants will be asked before an appointment is made to address the Council and competent European Parliament committee and to reply to questions. B, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union will then give their opinions and state their orders of preference. So I'd like to remind all of you that the LIBE committee has submitted a preparatory questionnaire to the shortlisted candidates. So they've got that. They have three common questions. The three shortlisted candidates have replied in writing to the questionnaire and the answers have been made available in the meeting documents. So you have this. I also want to inform you that the vote will take place on the 2nd of July. So we will vote to determine the order of preference of the candidates on the 2nd of July. I'm now going to draw by a lot the name of the candidate first to be heard. After this first candidate, we will follow the alphabetical order of candidates' names. It doesn't feel necessary with only three, but this is the way that it will be done. So I'm going to go like this, because as you know, LIBE is very transparent. And is that okay? Everyone happy? It's a transparent bowl. I don't want any accusations of bias. Okay. I don't know any of the candidates. They're none of my relatives, friends, or anything. No one Scottish or anything like that. Oh, right. Mr. O'Flaherty is first. I'm not Irish. I have a Scottish accent, as all of you know. Right, Mr. O'Flaherty, you are first. And then in alphabet, believe it or not, next we follow in alphabetical order. I mean, I could have just pulled another name out of the transparent bowl, but in fact the next is in alphabetical order. So Dutch colleagues never do well in this situation. So the next one is in alphabetical order.
Yes.
Derlan.
From this starting point.
Yeah, so Mr. O'Flaherty, then Mrs. van der Laan, and then Mrs. Brands-Kiris is the order. Okay. So I welcome Mr. O'Flaherty to the LIBE meeting. And so colleagues, sorry, please forgive me, it's been tiring today. I want to give some information on how the hearing will be structured. The candidate is invited to make an opening oral statement. Please, thank you, Mr. O'Flaherty. The candidate is invited to make an opening oral statement of no longer than 5 minutes. After the introduction, there will be time for 11 questions. Welcome to LIBE. But you got this far, I'm sure you're going to be able to handle this. After the introduction, there will be time for 11 questions from members. Each slot will be of 3 minutes, 1 minute for the question and 2 minutes for the answer. please be aware that I will have to be very strict in ensuring that the speaking time is respected. Otherwise, the last speaker will have no time left for their questions. Therefore, I have to warn you that if you exceed time, I will be obliged to interrupt you. Thank you for your understanding. So please stick to time. I won't go over time if that's okay. And I'll do this for every candidate. Interpretation is provided for you, and you can therefore use the official language of your choice, keeping in mind that what you say needs to be interpreted. Therefore, please don't speak too quickly. Now, I give you the floor, Mr. Flaherty, for your presentation. So just to remind you again, you have to make an opening oral statement of no longer than 5 minutes. So are you ready to go? Are you happy to? Colleagues, are you all ready? Stop chatting. Give him a chance. Be kind. Colleagues, no chatting, no standing. It's not an easy gig, this one. So everyone ready? Please go ahead, Mr. O'Flaherty. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, honourable members of the committee. It's a great pleasure to come before you this afternoon. This morning, we also, with the delivery of the Fundamental Rights Agency report, what a great achievement the story of that agency has been over the relatively short period of its life. Well established, delivering useful resources to you to help you carry out your important responsibilities for the promotion and protection of fundamental rights of European citizens. As the agency goes forward, I would like to suggest, building on its accomplishments and its achievements, that it might wish to focus more particularly on 3 aspects of its work, if you'll allow me to briefly touch on those now. The first of those has to do with the mainstreaming of fundamental rights across all of the institutions of the European Union. Still, to this day, to a great extent, there is something of a silo when it comes to fundamental rights. They are engaged in certain contexts, but not in others, such as, for example, inadequately at least, the security context. And so the first is mainstreaming. The second area that I would suggest the agency could spend more time and attention to is, at the other direction, the Member States. Building up awareness of fundamental rights, in particular of the Charter, at the level of Member States. Now, that is not primarily the work of the agency. That should be done by national actors, by the Member States and by the national actors within those states. But the FRA has a very important role as a centre of excellence in catalysing this form of activity at the national level. And the third area of increased focus that I would suggest to you today has to do with those actors beyond the institutions and the state who have a crucial role in upholding fundamental rights. And I'm thinking in particular of the business sector. We need to engage with it much more vigorously, and the FRA can play a role in this, in helping it become aware of its responsibilities for the delivery of fundamental rights. Just think, for example, of data retention, or of the single digital market, and the extent to which the success will be determined by the behaviour of non-state actors. Now, as the Fundamental Rights Agency seeks to support you better, in these areas and across its other range of activities, why, you may ask, would I want the job, or why would I suggest that I'm qualified? Well, let me suggest some qualities that I think are important for the Director. In the first place, the Director of the FRA should be a passionate European. And I want to take this opportunity to assure you that I am a proud citizen of Europe, the Europe of values, the Europe that won the Nobel Peace Prize. Secondly, the Director needs to have experience of that most difficult of tasks, taking the dry norm, the human rights or the fundamental rights provision, and turning it into tangible public policy, legislation and action. And I would suggest that my 8 years' experience in the United Nations Human Rights Committee, in which I engaged in intensive dialogue with states across the world to assist them in delivering on their responsibilities, is proven experience in this regard. Another quality that the Director requires is the ability to understand the support function of the FRA. You make the policy, not the FRA. The FRA's role is to support you with the good data and analysis so that you can do your job. And again here, that is in some ways analogous to the work or the role I carried out as head of a national human rights institution, which is seeking to influence the executive in a not dissimilar fashion. The final area that I would wish to draw attention to in terms of the needs for the director have to do with a proven track record. I think to be director of the FRA, you have to show that you have delivered complex, high-level human rights objectives in your past. Now, I could point to a number of different examples, but let me just pick the most recent. Just last year, a major initiative to reform and strengthen the human rights oversight systems of the United Nations was concluded successfully by the UN General Assembly in New York. To a very large extent, the outcome of that process drew from a project which I led over a number of years, known as the Dublin process on the strengthening of that system. Something like 80% of the recommendations were drawn from the multi-stakeholder global consultative exercise that I led over 2 years, and out of which I condensed 100 ultimate conclusions. And as I say, I would suggest as the most recent example of a proof of the ability to deliver at the high level in the context of the complexity in which the FRA operates. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. O'Flaherty. And that concludes your opening statement. So we now go to the questions. Yep. Okay, sorry, this is new for me. So you're number one, so I'll get into this for the second questioner. So we begin with the first question for 3 minutes from the first coordinator, and that's Mrs. 1 minute question and 2 minutes answer, and that's from Mrs. Monica Hallmeyer for the EPP. So that's 1 minute question and 2 minutes answer. Okay. Monica, go ahead for 1 minute, please.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
1 second while he puts on his headphones and it's point. Okay. Please go ahead.
Following Commissioner Timmermans' announcement that
Your microphone is not
again will be about tolerance, namely how to prevent and combat anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, anti-minority hatred in our society. Which are some of the biggest challenges we face today in our societies? How do you see FRA contributing to this debate?
And just pause for 1 moment. We'll start the clock for 2 minute answer. So 2 minutes, please, for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this initiative of the Commission is an important one, and I've heard Vice President Timmermans say that he thinks it will reinforce the accountability frameworks of the European Union for the compliance by Member States. They've picked an issue that I think quite correctly is one of the, at least the 3 top issues in terms of violation of fundamental rights in the European Union. I think that the Fundamental Rights Agency can engage in a number of fashions. Firstly, by generating, as it is already doing, solid data on the incidence of hate speech and hate crime across the European Union in the disaggregated categories that have been specified for the colloquium. It can do this work quickly. You saw that in the response to the Charlie Hebdo situation. It can turn around good, solid work within a matter of even a month. And so I think that if materials of that type can be made available for October, this would be very useful indeed. Secondly, the agency has a role in providing technical advice with regard to the legal framework for the protection of rights in the context of extreme hate speech. It's a difficult area. European states don't all agree with each other on where you draw the line. Well, to my mind, you draw the line where the law says you draw the line, and the Fundamental Rights Agency can provide you with the technical advice in that regard. And finally, the colloquium will really only work if it is disseminated. And I believe Mr. Timmermans also recognises this. And so the Fundamental Rights Agency, I believe, has a role in helping spread the outcome of the colloquium at the level of Member States where it's most likely to make a difference.
Thank you very much. And the next question again, 1 minute question, 2 minute answer, is Peter Niedermüller for the S&D Group. Peter, it's Mario now, is it? do apologise, not making it any easier for you. So for the S&D group, it's Mario Lauriston. Mario.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Flaherty, you had very impressive CV. You have been dealt with very important aspects of aspects of fundamental rights. And you know that in this committee we very much are expecting that FRA will be our very important partner. Our urgent need is to have the very comprehensive instrument to compare the countries, member states, considering how they are fulfilling the fundamental human rights. Today we had a report from the FRA. It was a very good report, but there wasn't this kind of the comprehensive opportunity to have the certain indicators which are comparable for all countries. So how do you see? Is it the realistic expectation? Can the FRA, under your management, fulfill that, to provide us with kind of country-by-country reports?
2-minute answer, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Ms Lauriston. Yes, I was present for that exchange this morning. I believe that the Fundamental Rights Agency is going in the direction that you desire. This year's is a shorter, tighter report which does name the situation. It doesn't talk abstractly about problems. It says where the problems are. It also says where the good practice is, which I think is another very important function. The indicators methodology that the Fundamental Rights Agency has proposed and is already applying in such areas as with regard to Roma and children's rights is generating the disaggregated data that you need to make strong assessments. And so I believe that we're in a progression towards an ever stronger capacity of the agency to deliver the data to you, keeping in mind, of course, that the European Union did not set the FRA up as a monitoring body. And so it has to maintain the integrity of that. But nevertheless, it did set it up to give you the real information on what's happening in the European Union. And I think that could be strengthened, but it's also progressing.
Thank you very much. And the next question comes from Mrs. Helga Stevens for the ECR group. Helga, 1-minute question.
Ja, dank u wel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've also listened to that very interesting initial statement and looked at the annual report for the FRA. And when it comes to people with disabilities, that's part and parcel of international conventions which have been ratified by the European Union. And in the FRA, it's clear that that they want to position themselves as a kind of centre of excellence. And my question to you is precisely on that concept of the centre of excellence. Implementation of conventions for people with disabilities. What does that look like in practice? How is that implemented? And then secondly, on the question of mainstreaming people with handicaps in this area as well. Very often there is discrimination and that's dealt with separately. For example, LGBTI, there are individual agreements and that's an area where you often get multiple handicaps, for example, black women with a particular disability.
Your answer, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to Ms Stevens. The ratification by the European Union of the CRPD, the Disability Convention, is an international good practice. It's quite remarkable that a regional body such as the Union would take on this heavy commitment and make itself accountable formally in the context of disability. So I believe in any case that Europe is already setting a very high standard of good practice, at least in the level of making the commitment. In terms of delivering on the commitment, the Fundamental Rights Agency has a critical role to play in providing you and the other institutions with key data on how it's being implemented across the Union. There are 2 areas, for example, that come to mind. One is reasonable accommodation. To what extent is the principle of reasonable accommodation being addressed across the Member States and by the institutions themselves? And then a second, equally challenging concept has to do with issues of capacity. and how the autonomy of the subject is respected, even when that person is living with a disability. And so the FRA can generate the material so that you can draw the conclusions. I entirely agree with Ms Stevens with regard to what we call in human rights or fundamental rights the intersectionality of disadvantage. Yes, if somebody lives with a disability and also happens to be lesbian, gay or LGBT, or happens to be from a minority or happens to be Roma, yes, they will experience they will have a negative experience that's greatly increased. And any sophisticated analysis of the situation of fundamental rights in Europe must be intersectional. It must acknowledge the complexity of our identities and the way in which these different elements of who we are interplay, either to make us stronger than the neighbour or weaker or at a greater disadvantage. And this must be absolutely at the centre of how the FRA does its work.
Thank you. Next for 1 minute question from Mr. Shogor for the EPP. Chaba.
Thank you, Chair.
I'm so sorry. My apologies. That was wrong. The next question is from Cecilia Wickstrom for the ALDE Group for 1 minute. My apologies. My apologies to the candidate as well. Cecilia Wickstrom for ALDE for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Dear Mr. Flaherty, your academic credentials are really impressive, so I will spare you any questions related to them. But the future director for the Fundamental Rights Agency must also be a good manager, and I would appreciate if you could elaborate a bit more on that. Do you have experience in managing an organization of a size similar to the FRA? How many persons directly reporting to you have you had? And the largest budget would be interesting to know of that you have been responsible for. And to be even a bit more concrete and maybe a bit personal, maybe you could give us an example of a management issue that you have been handling successfully during your past experience. And I did well on time, huh? Thank you.
You're doing a lot better than I am. Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia, and my apologies again to the candidate and to colleagues. You have a 2 minute answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'll manage the answer in the time, but nevertheless, yes. I've been managing organisations for a very great deal of time. I have managed human rights field operations of the United Nations in conflict and post-conflict settings, in Bosnia already 20 years ago, more recently in places such as Sierra Leone. Highly complex, highly difficult operations to run in the middle of wars. I subsequently managed a very large team and significant budget at when I was director, or coordinator rather, for the Asia-Pacific programmes of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. When you counted our field staff and headquarters staff, that was coming close to 100 at that time. I don't recall the exact budget. I'm afraid I'd probably misspeak if I were to give you a figure right now. More recently, I directed as Chief Commissioner the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, a relatively small operation, a staff of about 20-25 people, but dealing with some very intractable problems in a context of public service budget cuts. And perhaps there is the example you're seeking as to managing a very difficult context, and that was successfully managing the downsizing of an operation through the cutting of its budget through no fault of its own, which required extremely painful decisions around matters such as redundancy, while keeping the ship stable and continuing to deliver the services that the public expected. And while I regret the inevitable human suffering that was involved in that exercise, I'd be of the view that it was nevertheless successful.
Slightly there's a slight concern which I didn't anticipate, which is we have to ask 11 questions split amongst the political groups, but we don't have a GUE colleague to ask a question. I'm just for the time being move on to question 6, which is the Greens, which would be Judith Sargentini. So Judith, do that while I think about some Kafkaesque type solution to this. But if you ask your question to the candidate, we'll keep it cohesive. So 1 minute question, please, from the Greens. Judith Sargentini.
That will be fast thinking from your side then, Claude. Mr. Flaherty, you just said the European Union did not set up the FRA as a monitoring body, but that is where the political difficulty lies, because I think lots of us in the European Parliament would like the FRA to be a monitoring body. So my question to you is, how do you see yourself in that political game where member states do not like benchmarks that compare the one country to the other, where there are games being played on your funding and your annual planning, and the wish to get legislation in place for fundamental rights is based upon the data that you are collecting. What's your role there? How do you see the political role of your organisation?
Thank you very much, Ms. Sangotini. The role of the agency is to deliver the impeccable information to policymakers and bodies such as yours to draw your conclusions. Inevitably, that will and already does reflect on the situation in the member states. It tells you what's happening on a given topic and whether that is or is not compatible with the international standards and in particular the Charter. But it would not be for the FRA to enter into some form of judgment on any institution or any member state. I would suggest that would be to tread on the responsibility of Parliament and the other institutions. And so I continue to be of the view that the role of the FRA is a supportive role to you as you work out how to strengthen the accountability frameworks. As you do that, by the way, and I'm aware that that's a matter that's been considered here in the LIBE committee, the FRA can provide you with expert technical assistance. What are the various monitoring models? How do they operate in practice? How can one draw integrated attention to the finding of the existing monitoring frameworks in Europe? How could one best complement rather than compete with the Council of Europe monitoring frameworks? Things of this nature. I think the FRA could play a role there, but ultimately I think monitoring and delivering some sense of a finding with regard to states and the institutions would not be the role of the agency as it's currently conceived.
Thank you very much. I'm just reading the rules. It says after the introduction there will be time for 11 questions from members. I'm splitting them amongst groups. Next I have the EFDD. Is there a colleague from the EFDD here? There isn't. Yeah, no, there isn't. I'm just being rhetorical. Honestly, you've got to get me after all this time. Okay, there isn't a colleague from the EFDD. We're obviously moving into these diminishing returns of Thursday afternoon. So what I'm thinking is I'm just going to keep going. But it may be unfair for some colleagues to have less questions than others. And so I'm just going to get to the end and then see whether any other colleagues have a question, because I think it's fair that everyone gets the maximum number of questions. So let me just keep going. I just saw Mrs. Mayer going, which is not helpful because ENF has got question 8. Is there anyone else from the ENF? This is the new political group, for colleagues who didn't know. She just left, which is a bit... it's slightly irritating because she just left and she would have asked a question. Okay, 9 non-escrit, anyone from there? Nope. Okay, so now, Mr. Shogar, the moment is now yours. You are at number 10, and apologies for before. Please ask your question with apologies for before. You're number 10 from the EPP, so please ask your question. 1 minute.
Thank you. I try to be very short. How can you help the Commission and Member States implement the Charter? I'm referring on traditional national minorities who are facing a lot of discrimination. There are even language laws, collective guiltness laws still in Europe. How can you help that the Member States and the Commission should implement what is written in the Charter? Many cases we got from the FRA and from the Commission, even from Mr. Timmermans, that it's a Member State issue. I'm not telling all the bad students of the EU, but just some of them like Greece, France, Romania, Slovakia.
Thank you, Csaba. The candidate for up to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shogar. I believe that the most useful response to your question is to recall the role, the potential role that the Fundamental Rights Agency has in bringing the Charter to life at the national level. Realistically, it's not in use yet at the national level. A few court cases, almost no perception, I think 14% in the general population. That's not acceptable. We need to bring this to life as a constitutional framework within the Member States so that it can be relied on by national actors. The Charter has a lot to say to the plight of minorities from any category, from any part of society, and so this empowering exercise for fundamental rights holders would, I think, have direct beneficial impact in the area that you've just mentioned.
Thank you very much. We have a question 11 for Ana Gomez, S&D. Ana, would you like to ask?
I was going to ask you again on the monitoring or non-monitoring role. But would you be able, you think that the agency would be in a position to supply members of this Parliament with data similar to the European semester, looking at the evolution of budgets, but actually looking at the evolution of budgets and as well the implications in human rights, namely considering what has happened under the Troika and is happening still now in fundamental rights of the European citizen?
2 minutes, please. Up to 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Gomez. The very short answer is yes, I believe indeed yes. I think that the Fundamental Rights Agency would welcome more requests for information from the Fundamental Rights Agency that stretch the horizontal application of fundamental rights into all areas and breadth of the Union's engagement, including with regard to such matters as austerity and the socio-economic impact. Now, I do realise we have to operate within multi-annual frameworks and things of that nature, but fundamental rights cannot be parked in a corner. It's not something discrete that can be separated out of another issue. It's a quality that must inform every aspect of the Union's work, and so that's why I find your suggestion a very constructive one indeed.
Okay, colleagues, I have an idea, which is that we've asked quite a number of questions to the candidate. He's made his opening statement. The time is quite late. I know people are having to go and so on. So what we could do, with your permission, and let me know right away, what we could do in fairness to the other candidates, a very serious post, very important. Some of you have done equal opportunities, employment practice. So what I think is helpful is if you're committed to staying, the colleagues who asked the questions, if we do the same for each candidate in the sequence which I've just set out, because I think they were very good questions and covered reasonably good ground, we could do exactly the same. Would that be helpful? It was quite a good political balance as well. Would that be helpful, that we do that exactly the same for the next two candidates? Would that be... Sorry? Okay, one at a time. Judith first and then Cecilia.
I was going to say, I think the same amount, fine, but not necessarily the same questions.
You can modify
these are
them.
3 individuals.
Of course, sorry.
Okay.
You could modify the questions, but
fine.
if you could, same rough ground, but modify compared to what they had said. Oh, yeah.
Same amount.
Oh, no, that's a very British thing.
But we'll do
actually
same
do
amount,
that, yeah.
fine.
Yes, same
Okay.
amount, rough ground, but same people. Can we do that? Would that be helpful? Let's do that, and then in that case we can finish at this point, and no other questions. Is that fair enough? Okay, let's move on. And with that, then I thank members for the questions. I thank Mr. O'Flaherty for his participation, with some little mistakes, given you were first, and I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Flaherty. Thank you. So, colleagues, let's now move to our next candidate, which is Ms. van der Laan, who will enter the room. Yes. So we start with Peter. Oh, we have to switch to Peter for the S&D. So one modification. Okay. So we just have that one modification, do we? Okay.
Yes, President.
Hello, Ms. van der Laan. I have to be very formal.
Yes, please.
Okay. Welcome, Ms van der Laan. Obviously, some people know you. You're a former member of the European Parliament. I have to say that. It's just an elephant in the room that I have to push away. So you're very welcome. If I can, colleagues, can I just move quickly along, if that's okay with everyone? As you know, time is tight. You were a former MEP, so you know it's Thursday afternoon, so I'll just move swiftly along. It's a very warm welcome to you to the LIBE meeting. Just to give you some information on how the hearing will be structured, you as the candidate will be invited to make an opening oral statement of no longer than 5 minutes. After the introduction, there will be time for 11 questions, for a set number of questions from members. Each slot will be of 3 minutes, 1 minute from the members of Parliament. It will be exactly the same number of questions as your fellow candidates, and then 2 minutes, up to 2 minutes for your answer. And I'll say that at each time, so to remind you. Please be aware that I'll be strict in ensuring that the speaking time is respected, and that's the same for each candidate. Interpretation is provided so you can use the language of your choice, but please don't speak too quickly. You know all this, you are a member of the European Parliament. I'm now going to give you the floor for your presentation of up to 5 minutes, and then we will ask you your questions. So Ms van der Laan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished members. It's a great pleasure to be back again in the committee where I served over 10 years ago as Vice President. In those days, after the 9/11 attacks, it was this committee that had to find the balance between new security measures and guarding our fundamental rights. Much has changed in the fundamental rights landscape since then, not least the entry into force of the Charter 5 years ago. And I'm not surprised to see the LIBE Committee remains one of the pillars of commitment to making fundamental rights a reality for all in the EU. Sadly, we are not there yet. We still see high levels of anti-Semitism and discrimination against Roma and people with disabilities, violence against women and LGBTI people, violation of children's rights, racism and hate speech, access to justice denied, and discrimination based on origin and religion. The FRA has developed into a crucial part of the fundamental rights landscape, and in the coming years it will be needed more than ever. As Europe finds new answers to serious economic and security questions we face, we need to ensure our policies respect fundamental rights, that they are fact-based, taking into account evidence of what really works, and that we spend our limited resources wisely for maximum impact. At the same time, the agency's data should continue to serve those fighting, like you, for an inclusive and diverse Europe without discrimination, with all our freedoms guaranteed. Now, I know that I'm a different kind of candidate for this position because I have held elected office for 8 years. Some see that as an advantage because it gives me a fresh perspective and skills that can benefit the FRA, such as linking our fundamental rights work to ongoing debates at the right time and knowing how to influence the agenda. Some may see it as a disadvantage because I had a certain political color. But to those I would say, I fully realize that FRA can only be successful if it is politically neutral and operates within its legal remit, and I am committed to keeping it that way. After the political part of my career, when I joined the International Criminal Court as the Chief of Staff of the highest judge, the situation was no different, and I can confidently say I have a track record of being neutral in public service. Indeed, the International Criminal Court was also an evidence-based institution where evidence made the difference between going to jail or not going to jail. So we left the politics to the politicians while reminding them of the legal framework within which they should operate, but also for opportunities to improve justice for victims. Now, you, the members of LIBE, often take momentous decisions under time pressure to address urgent humanitarian challenges, such as now with the migrants and refugees drowning off our coasts. You may need to decide whether to invest new resources to fight anti-Semitism or discrimination. And whenever you formulate these policies, I look forward to being there to help you with evidence-based data, to help you know what is really effective. The FRA needs to remain an essential partner for the European Parliament, because in the coming years we need to embed a deep fundamental rights culture throughout the EU. And I believe my experience can help link FRA's valuable work to ongoing debates and to ensure objective EU comparative information reaches key players like you, but also the Council, agencies, and FRA's many partners all around Europe for maximum impact. Now, while vision and dedication are key, we should not forget that it is not the director, but the management board, in cooperation with the institutions and partners, that decide the priorities. FRA thus also needs an experienced manager to implement those priorities and ensure that resources are used effectively and that the staff remain motivated and efficient. As ICC Chief of Staff, I served as certifying officer and manager responsible for HR, budget and finance matters for the judiciary of the ICC, which is 90 full-time staff. I represented the judiciary for court-wide management issues like strategic planning, the full budget cycle and risk management. The ICC has a budget of about 100 million and 1,000 staff. I helped set up an independent audit committee and an independent oversight mechanism. FRA is only as effective as its staff, and I look forward to engaging their expertise for maximum impact. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, as Europe faces economic and security challenges, there is a risk that fundamental rights are taken for granted or even considered a luxury for better times. But the opposite is true. They need to be guaranteed. Taxpayers need to know that the resources of FRA are spent keeping it a useful, helpful institution, finding real long-term solutions. I would be very honored to be part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms van der Laan. I'm going to go straight to the questions now. And the first question is from Ms Monica Hallmeyer of the EPP, and she's going to ask a 1-minute question followed by your 2-minute answer. Monica, your question.
Herr Vorsitzender, die Menschenrechtsagentur.
Mr. Chairman, the Human Rights Agency is active in many different fields. The Fundamental Rights Agency, it's particularly active in the spheres of competence of various other specialised agencies. That means that in several areas there are overlaps and the agencies have to come to an agreement as to how they interact. How do you envisage coming to agreements with other agencies to avoid overlaps and doubling up of duties? How do you envisage working perhaps on thematic bases with various different agencies, or agreeing on certain contents to divide up the work between the different agencies in order to allow each agency to do their jobs?
2 minutes, please. Up to 2 minutes, please.
Herzlichen Dank für Ihre Frage.
Thank you very much for that question. When it comes to cooperation with different agencies and different institutions, the Council of Europe, the various different institutions such as the OECD, we focus essentially on this form of cooperation because we have so much to do and we can't do everything individually. But it is important to have agreements signed with agencies such as Frontex and EASO to delineate and demarcate this cooperation. We have agreements with those two agencies. We have to make sure the fundamental rights strategy is integrated properly into those different institutions, and we do that through the agreements. For example, with the police academies, making sure that people are receiving the right training with regard to fundamental rights. So this cooperation is what makes the whole thing effective. We have to look at where we can add value and how we can work together with other agencies to have the best possible impact. Together with the European Parliament, we do that as well. We've got the research department here in the European Parliament. We have to make sure that we don't overlap the work done there. So I think this cooperation is working well, but can still be improved in many different areas so that we get maximum impact. Thank you.
Do forgive me for I mixed up my 1 minute with my 2 minutes. Okay, the next question is Peter Niedermüller for the S&D. 1 minute question, please, Peter.
Thank you very much. Mrs. van der Laan, given the ongoing difficulties faced by the Roma in many European countries in terms of educational segregation, but also generally speaking discrimination on the field of housing, health and labour market, what is your target during your future mandate for Roma integration strategies in order to breathe new life into those integration strategies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think most of the targets, of course, have already been outlined in national Roma integration strategies. What the key role for FRA is, as I see it, is not to redo that work, but to make sure that the targets that member states themselves have set, that those will be implemented. And the way to do that, of course, is to keep monitoring the situation. And this, the Commission has clearly outlined in its communication. There is a role for FRA here. It has done a lot of analysis, and your assessment is completely right. There is still a lot of work to be done. Housing, education, employment, the discrimination is still there, and we have to make sure that, that Roma can fully participate and get all of their fundamental rights. The role for FRA, I think, therefore, is not to set new targets or to change the targets, but to work with the existing member states to achieve what they've promised they're going to achieve. Now, this is not easy, and the new project that FRA is doing is working at the local level. So to go into the local communities, to see what are the actual obstacles that not only Roma are experiencing, but also non-Roma people are experiencing, and then to see what works on the ground. And what I would really like to see FRA do is to see where we have promising projects, where we can see that we have real effects, real achievements, and then if those projects could be duplicated in other member states, to make sure that people know what really works. Because we cannot year after year keep on analyzing the data and say, the situation is still bad, the situation is still bad. We have to then say what actually works, who is achieving something, and then to try to disseminate that to make sure that resources are implemented in the right way so that we get maximum effect. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question from the ECR group is Mr. Jurek.
Dziękuję bardzo. Chciałem zapytać Panią o...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can I ask the following question? It's Article 14.4 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is about the elderly. For example, the question, the parents who are against homosexuality being added to the school curriculum as being part of sex education. There are countries such as Croatia, Slovakia, where there have been referenda on the subject, where parents have been very much in a majority against that kind of thing being added to the curriculum. And my question is, what would you do? Because these parents have got certain rights under Article 14 of the Charter.
Your answer for up to 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Article 14 is, of course, about the right to education. And even though there is a clear right to education, it is not up to the FRA to dictate what each school in each member state is going to be teaching in its educational curriculum. I think that would be going too far. The question that you raise about LGBTI people feeling safe in schools is an extremely important issue. And I come from the country that first that opened up marriage to same-sex couples, and I now live in a country, Slovenia, where we just actually managed to change the legislation to open up marriage to same-sex couples. And what we see is that legislation is only one part of the story, because if you have legal equality, that doesn't mean that people feel safe. It doesn't mean that students feel safe to come out in schools. It doesn't mean that they won't be beaten up or experience violence. And I think the FRA studies show that very clearly, that the level of violence against LGBTI people in the European Union is still unacceptably high. And this is, I think, the same as the situation with Roma. What I would like to see is not only that we monitor the situation and year after year have to report that the situation is bad and that we see trends which may even indicate it's getting worse. What I would like to see is what can we actually do to improve the situation. In the Netherlands, they have introduced legislation in my country to give education on this. I would like to see if it works. I would like to see if it has impact, and if it does, to share those experiences. And then, of course, it is up to other member states to decide, for you to decide, for national parliaments to decide. We now have FRA has focal points in national parliaments to decide if this is something you would like to emulate, to make sure that everyone in Europe can have their fundamental rights, including sexual minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next question is from Cecilia Wickstrom for the ALDE Group. For 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much. You mentioned in your introduction your experience as Chief of Staff of the President of the International Criminal Court, and you stressed the relevance this past position would provide should you be appointed a Fundamental Rights Agency Director. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on how this experience within a purely judicial institution could be pertinent for you if you are to be appointed head of an EU agency such as the FRA?
Up to 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I already mentioned my experience in managing the ICC, and there we had a very diverse staff, but I won't repeat that. I think there's some other aspects that are very relevant. The first is that the International Criminal Court, as you all know, is a judicial body which has to function within a political world. There is a lot of criticism at that time also from the African Union, from various countries. Why do you deal with Sudan and not with Syria? Well, that, of course, is not the choice of the ICC. That is the choice of the UN Security Council. And you can only operate so far, and to make it clear that within the mandate, you're doing everything you can. I think this is a situation that FRA will often find itself in, where many actors would like it to go further, but it is simply not possible because a mandate is a mandate. And to explain that, and I think it's important to guard that independence in the political world, but at least to protect it, then it's good to know how the political world works. Another parallel I see is we had a very strong debate about peace versus justice, as if you couldn't have the two together. And I feel that sometimes the discussion about security versus fundamental rights puts them in opposition. Whereas they're two sides of the same coin. I think Morten Kierum said that in this committee at some point. It's not that one is hard and one is soft. They're both hard sides of the same coin. And I would like to make sure that it stays that way, that it's not something where we see we can compromise one for the other. We can have them both. And finally, in my last half minute, I think when I came into the ICC, it's 95% of the staff were experts in criminal law, which I'm not. And it was actually quite interesting that you could bring new skills, precisely because I was not someone who had been doing this for 10 years, but you can have an outside perspective and bring in communication, strategy, and other skills. And in this way, as FRA director, I don't want to be like the researcher-in-chief. I want to take the expertise that is there, with full respect for the people that are there, and make sure that we maximize the impact that they have.
Thank you very much. From the Greens, it's Ulrika Lunacek this time. Thank you.
Thank you, and also welcome to the LIBE Committee. I wasn't here when you were here, so that's nice to meet you now. You said yourself that sometimes, especially in times of economic and security challenges, some people see fundamental rights as a luxury. Well, we have the situation that even some member states, some political parties, some politicians see the work the Fundamental Rights Agency is doing, or the issue of fundamental rights in general, as some kind of infringement on subsidiarity and want to keep it to member states themselves, especially when it's about topics that may seem conflictive, be it gender equality, LGBT rights, Roma rights, or other minority rights. So how will you deal with these member states or politicians? How will you convince them that fundamental rights is neither a luxury nor it is something that infringes on the subsidiarity of member states?
Well, in a way, it's almost a very easy task because all of them have signed up to the Charter. All of them have signed up to international human rights instruments, the Convention for People with Disabilities, various UN treaties. So there's so much that is there that they have themselves committed to, mostly by purely democratic processes with national parliaments buying into it. So this is not something that anyone is imposing. This is something that we choose, the standards we choose to hold ourselves to. Having said that, the reality on the ground is different. We know that. And I think this is a matter where you have to always choose the facts and the evidence that go with the relevant issues. And what I find impressive about the work that FRA has done and how it's built this up over the past years is that when you see the facts and you see how much work still needs to be done, it almost automatically guides the way that you need to go. Because it outlines the problems, it outlines which member states could be doing better, it gives good examples on how to move forward. And I think some of it is simply to keep on talking and to keep on pushing and to keep on convincing and to engage at various levels. But this is not only the job of the FRA. We have so many colleagues, NGOs, civil society, trade unions, religious organizations, so many in Europe, where if we all do it together, then we can keep that momentum and make it clear that this is not a luxury. This is something which is essential, and this makes us, as Europeans, this is our core value.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, in the interests of fairness, Mrs. Mayor of the new ENF group, who had gone, I thought had permanently gone, has come back and has indicated she does want to ask a question. I think it's only fair just to take her question. So, Mrs. Mayor, for the ENF group, please ask your question.
Dank u.
Thank you very much. Mrs. van der Laan, a few years ago, you said that you were worried about an Islamic community outside of Dutch society. And in your, were you to be director of FRA, what would be your view about there being an Islamic pillar outside the main population?
Dank u wel voor uw vraag.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that we've got to be concerned about any group which doesn't feel comfortable or at home in Europe in terms of their being part of the community. I wouldn't make any distinction against people from other origins, be that religious or anything else. When I said that, and I still take that view, there was a debate about integration of people and the kind of Netherlands or the kind of Europe. I think that we want to see a diverse Europe where everyone can be themselves, irrespective of their origin, their colour of their skin, their sexual orientation, their religion. And that, I think, is the essence of fundamental rights. They apply to all. They are there for everyone. And as director of FRA, were I to be appointed, the important thing is that everyone knows what the rights are and that everyone should have proper and full enjoyment thereof. Of course, there are differences. The colloquium, for example, there is anti-Semitism, anti-Islam, discrimination on sexual orientation. There are disputes. But the job of FRA is not to prioritise those things. There is, of course, the multi-annual programme, is to make sure that the fundamental rights are seen to be enjoyed. They're there for everyone. Thank you.
I think Mrs. Holmeyer has indicated for the question previously taken by Mr. Shogor. Okay, Monica, for 1 minute.
So my second question relates to the most sensitive group in our society, namely children. With new internet technology, we're seeing new possibilities for brutal attacks on children. There's been a huge increase in such attacks, particularly people abusing children. There's been a huge increase in that recently. Now, there are very difficult questions related to this on encryption, how we can act preventively, how we can give police supportive measures to help them do their job. We've got, on the one hand, data protection and all that's connected with data protection on the internet, but also, on the other hand, the need to prosecute people who misuse the internet in this way. So how do you position yourself within the FRA in this very sensitive debate, trying to protect children but trying to ensure data protection at the same time?
Thank you very much, and I share your assessment that this is one of the most horrid crimes and that we need to do everything to try to protect children. And that whereas, as you indicate, everyone should have the right to privacy, that does not entail being able to hide crimes against children. Now, there is a an ongoing discussion about privacy, about data retention, about data protection. So one of the first things, of course, would be to work with the European Data Protection Supervisor on this. And it is really up to you, the Parliament, and your national colleagues to see how to weigh these different aspects. The task of the FRA, I think, should be, again, to share best practices. There may be countries that have done a better job than others in trying to balance the right to privacy and the protection of children. We should learn from that. We should make sure that the guarantees that are there are actually implemented. A lot of times it is not a matter of new legislation, but actually making sure that existing legislation works. And it's, of course, we are there to support you with data, again, with surveys and with trends. I think the moment we see that there is an increase in abuse and that the internet is being used to hide criminal activities like that, it should immediately come to your attention so that the politics can get into action, because this is not something where we can wait for the trend to crystallize out over 4 or 5 years and see we have a problem. This is something where urgent action would be needed.
Okay, and the final question, in fact, is Peter Niedermüller, it's been indicated, replacing Anna Gomez is the final question. No, Anna, Peter is replacing you because we have to watch the clock. Is that okay? Peter, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And sorry, Anna. Mrs. von der Leyen, given the current situation in a number of member states, it is very clear, at least for me, that the current rule of law mechanism is not sufficient. How do you see the idea to initiate an in-depth monitoring process on the situation of democracy, rule of law and fundamental rights in those countries? What do you think that an enforcement of the current mechanism to examine the compliance with the Copenhagen criteria in member states after accession in place is necessary? And if yes, how would you imagine this could work?
Thank you very much. When I was in the cabinet of Commissioner Van den Broek working on the accession, the Copenhagen criteria, and especially the ones focused on democracy and the rule of law, were absolutely essential. And it shows that it is possible to do this country by country annual analysis. The Commission has done it, but only for the candidate states. Now, the discussion about the gap between, warning countries about what's going on and then having to use the nuclear weapon of Article 7 is one that has been going on for a long time. And I know that in this Parliament there is a majority, not a very large one, but there is a majority for a new mechanism. I know that the European Commission has its new framework. And the real question is, will there be political consensus to start with something new? Now, this is not the job of the director of FRA to decide. Obviously not. If the mandate should be changed, should be expanded, then I think FRA should be ready, if there's a task for us, to do that, of course, given that we would have the resources. At the same time, I think there is already an incredible amount of information which is there. You can almost copy-paste the various reports that are there and make your own country reports. I looked at the hate crime report. I copy-pasted some things about Slovenia. I sent it to one of my colleagues and said, look, this would be the country report for Slovenia on hate crime, and it just outlined exactly what needed to be done. So I think if you take the data that, for example, the country reports that are produced in the Council of Europe, the various data in the specialized reports of the FRA, other agencies and institutions that have data, there is already quite a lot we can do. If you decide that more should be done and a separate mechanism should be set up, then of course FRA would be ready to work together with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms van der Leyen, and thank you for your answers, and that completes your participation today at the hearing. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your questions to Ms van der Leyen. And we now welcome Ms. Thank you very much.
Am I excused, or should I wait around?
That's a good question. So, colleagues, we now welcome Ms. Brands Keres to the LIBE meeting as she's approaching. Thank colleagues again for their patience and participation at this late moment on Thursday. Very much appreciated. And to staff, of course, as well. Everyone that stayed. Welcome to you, Ms. Brands-Keris. You ready?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I just want to give you some information on how the hearing will be structured. You as the candidate will be invited to make an opening oral. You're much further away than the other candidates. I don't know if I've done anything, but that's okay. That's okay. It's very wise, very wise. You get extra points for that. I want to give you some information on how the hearing will be structured. You will be invited to make an opening oral statement of no longer than 5 minutes. After that introduction, there will be time for several questions from our members. Those questions will be in a slot of 3 minutes, 1 minute for the question and then up to 2 minutes for your answer. Please be aware I will be very strict in ensuring that speaking time is respected, so please don't go over those limits. Interpretation is provided so you can speak in the language of your choice, but please don't speak too quickly because the interpretation requires that you speak moderately. I give you now the floor for that 5 minute opening statement. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very happy that this moment is finally here. I wanted to briefly make 5 points as my introduction. One is starting in the big picture, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which can be seen as a vision of how to translate the values of the EU into norms and principles, and that guide the action in reality and the respect of fundamental rights. The establishment of the Fundamental Rights Agency in 2007 expressed a commitment to actually making this an operational reality. And the FRA is a unique and an innovative agency in the field of human rights for several reasons. It brought together, as the Charter does, the until then often separate strands and discourses of equality and human rights into a comprehensive approach. It adopted an explicitly multidisciplinary approach to its work, and its aim is different from those very valuable institutions that monitor states' compliance and or violations of treaties and conventions. It is to assist, the focus on assisting EU institutions and member states in formulating policies based on evidence that the agency collects, analyzes, and expresses opinions and conclusions about, and also develops methodology to make this possible. FRA's effectiveness in contributing to fundamental rights protection is, of course, also linked to its focus on priority issues within the framework of the multi-annual framework, obviously. I think that also you in this committee and the urgent matters that you have dealt with very recently have seen that the FRA's focus and choice of priorities indeed does fall within the common interest that we have, both unfortunately in very urgent matters, as recently with migration, both asylum, irregular migration, and also integration of migrants, personal data protection, racism, and unfortunately hate crime against both ethnic minorities, LGBT, and other vulnerable minorities. Beyond that, the issue is long-term and also focusing in on long-term issues where the agency is well-placed to work on anti-discrimination on all grounds, Roma inclusion, rights of persons with disabilities, rights of the child, access to justice, and others. The point is that the FRA needs to be responsive to the needs of its key stakeholders without being purely reactive. The FRA has the responsibility and the expertise to be able to proactively identify gaps in policies and shortcomings in implementation, a big problem, as we know, therefore contributing to both awareness raising and agenda setting. At the strategic level, notably the mainstreaming of fundamental rights, a big topic these days, and with all of the developing strategies where fundamental rights are rightly stressed as a fundamental point to observe. FRA is, of course, a self-evident contributor to these developments by bringing expertise, analysis, data, but also being well placed for an overall view of the various components to ensure consistency and comprehensiveness of the approach. Fourth point, in order to be effective, FRA is independent, but it also needs to be relevant, not only by the priorities, but obviously also working in cooperation with all key actors in the field, both listening but also providing, of course, input and expertise. That's the key stakeholders, the EU institutions, member states, but also all other relevant actors, the agencies, the independent human rights institutions, equality bodies, but also civil society, of course, broadly speaking, including beyond NGOs, also academia and professional organizations. The very important factor is the good cooperation and actual cooperation with external relevant actors, Council of Europe, par excellence, also the United Nations, the OSCE. And I mean cooperation not just in discourse and proclaiming it, but and not just checking meetings, box checking for meetings that are had, but actually timely consultation strategically and a target cooperation. This moment is a moment of change in many ways. The changes within with a new parliament, the urgency, the Commission, and also the Council expressed a renewed commitment to fundamental rights. FRA...
You're running over time, I'm sorry,
okay.
You must conclude.
Good. FRA will contribute.
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry, we have to be very strict. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So we go to our first question, and for 1 minute from the EPP, Mrs. Monica Holmar. Monica, for 1 minute, please.
Vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender. The EU has already set up a consistent and comprehensive legal framework, Convention on Human Rights, EU Charter, treaty, secondary legislation, to effectively tackle possible breaches of fundamental rights and anti-discrimination, or do you think there are still some loopholes in our legal system? If so, which ones? Would you as Director focus more on how to effectively implement those provisions to ensure that our citizens feel in their daily life that their citizens' rights are respected? And what kinds of actions would you consider to make sure the rights are in this fact protected?
Thank you. And the answers for up to 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. I do think that we can be proud within the EU that we have a very strong framework, that it is, of course, building also on the fact that the European Convention for Human Rights is there for all member states, but of course the development of the Charter and the secondary legislation from there. We're particularly strong on anti-discrimination. However, as we have seen, we both have problems in the implementation of the existing directives. This also goes for some other directives that are there. And, of course, one of the gaps that you are asking about very clearly is the long time it has taken to move ahead with the adoption of the horizontal directive. The discussions that need to be had in Parliament and among Member States to really move ahead on strengthening that which really is based on gaps. I think that for the Fundamental Rights Agency, there is a dual role, in my view. Clearly a very strong focus on implementation. As we know, this is very much the problem. We do have a strong framework, but in reality this does not translate into the protection on the ground very often, and in particular of the most vulnerable people who very often don't even know that they have rights, or at least not how they can actually make them effective or find remedies if their rights are violated. This is exactly where the Fundamental Rights Agency focuses on providing evidence, gathering data and doing the research and adding really the value added of having data that did not previously exist, both in large-scale surveys but also in collecting the existing information and providing it is useful.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from the S&D, Birgit Sippel. Birgit.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I would like to ask a question, let's say, in the area of homophobia. Our Commissioner Jourova publicly committed to advancing an LGBTI strategy on several occasions since taking up office, and in addition this Parliament again and again requested this several times, and unfortunately we believe this is necessary looking on the large number of discriminations and even on violent attacks against this group. So to work on a strategy for LGBTI people, what are your ideas to work on this, and how can you contribute to strengthen and improve such a strategy?
For up to 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Yes, it is, of course, a very important and big issue and has been for many years, but I think finally the moment is there where there is some momentum gathering within the EU, but actually beyond the EU as well, as we can see in some other countries. Clearly, policy action needs to be taken, and that is not the role of the Fundamental Rights Agency. However, the Fundamental Rights Agency has already provided data, and very serious and important data, that shows actual evidence of that which we hear in general, both from victims groups themselves and sometimes discussed by civil society and others, that indeed there is a very serious problem. Both in anti-discrimination, we know that the legislative framework, of course, is not complete. But at the same time, also in the experience of hate crime and hate speech, which of course is very much part of this as well. I think this is where the Fundamental Rights Agency has contributed and continue to contribute, of course, in showing the reality of life, the evidence that needs to be at the basis. The only effective policies can be taken and made on the basis of the evidence that is there. And I see primarily the role of the FRA here. The other part of that, which also refers to the previous questions of the double aspects of FRA roles, is of course also being able to analyze more specifically what are the shortcomings in the framework itself for equal treatment and the protection of LGBTI people. So I think that gathering evidence and analysing it is of course not the only way, but clearly providing the tools for the decisions that need to be made appropriately by the decision makers.
Thank you. Mr. Jurek of the ECR, please.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja powtórzę pytanie, które stawiałem poprzednio.
Thank you very much. I will repeat the question that I asked earlier on. I don't think you heard the question while the previous candidate was here. It related to Article 14, Paragraph 4 of the Basic Charter relating to parents and the education of their children, particularly when children are learning about homosexuality in schools and parents complain about that. This is a phenomenon that's being seen across Europe. In at least 2 member states of the European Union there have been protests against that, in Croatia and Slovakia. There have been national referenda in those countries, and society has spoken out against this kind of schooling en masse. There are families that want to shoulder their responsibility to protect their children. My question is, how does the FRA respond to that?
2 minutes, please.
Well, it is true, of course, that one needs to take into account all voices of and all opinions in the area of free speech that we have in Europe, thankfully, and a dialogue needs to be had, a serious dialogue. However, I think that in this particular field, we can see that despite the controversy, there are developments over the years when actual rights are explained to people, despite the strong argument for parental involvement and the choice of education, of course, relating to rights of child, it is very clear that LGBT issues are very much part of the fundamental values that we have of equality and equal right to participation for all, by the way, including for children. The environment for children in school has to be an open environment that is open to the existence and the acceptance of all, including minorities themselves. Now, for the Fundamental Rights Agency's role, I don't think that it is the role of the agency to go in and, unless requested, to go in and tell what kind of legislation and what kind of practice based on legislation needs to be there. However, the examples, the good practice examples from other countries is very much something that the Fundamental Rights Agency can collect. And in particular, we see also in the context, as I mentioned already, of the very serious situation in many, or at least some, EU member states that the LGBTI community faces, based simply on the experience of harassment, of violence, and of discrimination.
Thank you. And for the ALDE group, Cecilia Wickstrom. Cecilia.
Thank you very much. The decision of the appointment of the next FRA director will be taken by its management board, a body that you have been chairing for about 2 years. During that time, there was an exchange between the agency and the European Parliament Committee on Budgetary Control regarding its budgetary discharge, a main issue that led to a series of questions and requests from the CONT Committee related to allegations that it had awarded contracts to NGOs led by members of the Management Board of the agency. As you have been directly following this, could you give us some clarifications on how these concerns have been cleared by the Management Board that you were responsible for? What are your views on the agency transparency and accountability? And is there any lessons learned from this experience that you would like to share with us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very important question because we come into governance issues, but also management issues, of course, as they are connected. Indeed, there were questions, including in my own case, of a situation where the organization in Latvia that I at the time was director for also became the organization that won the contract for providing work for the Fundamental Rights Agency. At the time, I think that the procedures put in place some years ago were already transparent, of course, in line with the requirements of the EU. All members of the management board, of course, make a declaration of interest and state exactly what the situation is. In that particular case, I did as well, and in fact, I then did not have anything to do. The whole role of actually both writing the proposals and then dealing with the implementation was delegated to a person that I did not communicate with. I think that the following the rules and regulations of transparency is essential, and of accountability, of course. I think it is obviously the role of the Parliament to put the questions and see whether the answers to them are satisfactory. I believe in the firm governance. Sometimes we're maybe a little bit frustrated with the amount of time one ends up spending on following the rules and regulations and the kinds of governance tools that need to be put into place. But in my view, they are absolutely essential, and they are particularly for all of us, but particularly, I think, for an agency that is as sensitive as the Fundamental Rights Agency is, with a lot of different opinions on what are actually rights and how to go about them. And to avoid this, of course, we should be fully transparent.
Okay, thank you. And for the Greens, Judith Sargentini. Judith.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Particularly because you've been the chairperson of the management board of the FRA, you must have been thinking very often how how would I do things differently, and how do we of the FRA relate to the rest of the political spectrum in the European Union? Now, you have here a European Parliament with different wishes that would like to see, for instance, national reports and the FRA being there to monitor. We might differ of opinion, but I would like to see that. And you've got member states that are not necessarily happy with the work the FRA is doing, and we even saw blocking of a work programme of the FRA a couple of years ago. In that light, what would you, as a new director of FRA, do or not do? Where do you see your position in this political game?
Thank you. Yes, I think it is a very delicate matter that actually takes a lot of judgment from the director and from the governing body of the Fundamental Rights Agency. It is an independent agency. This is essential to do the work in the field of fundamental rights. But at the same time, of course, it is not an agency that takes political decisions. Those decisions are up to you and to member states, and whoever is the director and whoever is the governing board, of course, has to function within the mandate and competences given. This relates also to the debate that, of course, is a very interesting debate on the potential role of the Fundamental Rights Agency in the monitoring specifically of countries. And therefore, I don't think it would be up to me, in fact, to have an opinion whether, or to lobby for whether that should go ahead or be stopped. However, having said that, I think that in the already existing mandate of the Fundamental Rights Agency, of course, producing comparable data means that data from all 28 member states is being collected and produced and analysed. It is presented in a different way because it has an EU focus, and of course we're looking at the implementation of EU law. So that is there. Whether that can be used more proactively and whether there can be other ways of doing it, including peer reviews or something similar that exists in other bodies, is of course up to the bodies who decide to look at. I think it's important to note that of course there are other, as I mentioned in my introduction, bodies who do monitor specifically compliance with the European Convention for Human Rights, of course, also the other mechanisms within the Council of Europe and the UN. There's a lot of information there that can also be used.
Thank you. What do you think? Mrs. Mayer won't come back this time? We won't get a question on Islam then. Okay, that's fine. So we've got Mrs. Holmeyer again. You're going to get the you were going to get the prize for the most asked questions today. No, never mind. Csaba Sogor then.
Thank you. If I'm reading each year these fundamental rights agency reports, I never see any analysis or any report about discrimination regarding persons belonging to traditional national minorities. I don't know why. Because there is a lot of discrimination, not just on daily life, but also on legislation level. Do you see any possibility to help these member states to keep their promises, you know, the post-Copenhagen criteria problem?
Thank you, Csaba. Brief as ever. Thank you very much. And you have up to 2 minutes to answer that.
Yes, thank you. A question indeed close to my own heart, as having worked also very specifically with rights of persons belonging to national minorities within the Council of Europe context. As we know, the national minorities are now mentioned not only in the Charter, but also actually in the multi-annual framework for the Fundamental Rights Agency, in particular, of course, and specifically in relation to all of the grounds of anti-discrimination. However, we know that there is no specific secondary legislation that is binding, and the big question of how we proceed around this question, and including the very clear question that I have had also in my mixed background as a Latvian and as a Swedish citizen, is that the Copenhagen criteria, of course, are so strictly demanding inclusion of rights of persons belonging to national minorities, but this does not apply, obviously, to old member states, some of which have not taken this on for various reasons. I don't think, therefore, that there is a possibility of very specifically providing some kind of monitoring on this, but I think that the information, there has been a report from the Fundamental Rights Agency that of course came upon request by the Parliament concerning, including also the questions of national minorities, bringing together information that exists there, and of course also the issue of how this particular multi-annual framework with all of the different grounds that are listed there can be used in some ways in the data collection, in gathering information on evidence on the ground, is something that obviously the agency can reflect on.
Ms Brands-Keres, the final question is from S&D. It's from Mario Lauriston. Mario.
Thank you very much. And it's a bit connected with the previous question, but not about minorities, but about migrants. You started with the burning issue of migration, asylum seekers, and so on. So what do you think? What should be done to mainstream the fundamental rights in all aspects of EU migration policies? And where do you see now the biggest shortcomings, biggest challenges? And what can FRA do to make some impact on that?
Yes, the very urgency of this question, of course, FRA was bringing up many of the very issues that now you are all and we are all struggling with already last year in November in its annual conference, paying attention, bringing awareness to the issues and using its analysis and gathered data to really show very serious problems both in the asylum seeking systems implementation in practice, but also, of course, the irregular migrants and the further questions of integration of society. It seems that with the development of the agendas right now, and the strategies that are there, but also the migration agenda, it would seem logical that the agency should also have a role to follow up on the fundamental rights related questions in those. Of course, with due regard to the other agencies that are active in this field. We don't need duplication or overlapping mandates, but clearly there is very much work there to be done where the agency can provide additional information, additional analysis of the situation on the ground, as it has done, but to continue to follow the information, but to feed it into much more systematically into the development of these big agendas that want to be comprehensive, want to address the all EU questions, but very often, as we know, end up being either fragmented and going each in slightly separate directions, or backtracking from previous commitments and positions, or that don't belong together comprehensively. I think that the agency can have a very strong role in coordinating the existing information that comes there in the initiatives from the different institutions.
Thank you very much. Before I discharge Ms. Brands-Keres, colleagues, could I just thank all of you in particular for the committed LIBE members who have bothered to stay. We just couldn't have got through this without you staying and asking the excellent questions. We just couldn't have done the hearing on this Thursday afternoon. We were really in a fix in terms of scheduling all the important items for Thursday afternoon, so I particularly want to thank the committed LIBE members for doing that, and of course staff, and I really wish you a good weekend. On the 2nd of July we have the vote, and the order of preference will take place that day. And Mrs. Brands-Keres, that concludes your hearing, so thank you very much for your presence here today. Thanks very much, colleagues.